Dozens of world leaders, including Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta, have been identified as being involved in tax evasion using offshore accounts. It follows the release of the Pandora Papers, which details how the wealthy secretly hid money. Businesses have also allegedly used offshore tax havens to hide assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Other leaders named include the presidents of Gabon, the Republic of Congo, former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair, and the Jordanian King. Well, to help us make sense of these latest releases, the Pandora Papers, that is, we're joined by Open Secrets Director Hennie van Vuuren. Hennie, good evening to you, and thank you so much for your time. Sometimes it's hard to quantify exactly how big a data leak is, but perhaps in the best way that you can, comparatively, how big are these revelations in the Pandora Papers, and just how much data has been received here?
Hi, good evening, Kathy. Yeah, it is an extraordinary leak, and I think it is probably the biggest single leak of material detailing the financial arrangements of the world's wealthy, the rich, the powerful that we've yet seen. Kathy, you might recall the Panama Papers, and viewers might, from 5 years ago, which primarily focused on a law firm that was based in Panama, then Mossack Fonseca, and their clients, and the way in which offshore structures were set in Panama to hide the proceeds of people's wealth using that tax haven. This, in comparison, this is in fact a bigger leak. It's about 11 million pages, according to the International Consortium for Investigative Journalists. They've had a few hundred journalists digging away at it, and they've identified, from what we know thus far, approximately 200 to 300 different politicians, 30 heads of states, and of course countless corporations who are implicated in a global system of criminality, and they work through, from what we understand, at least a dozen offshore jurisdictions, the closest of which to us is the tiny island nation of Seychelles. So I think it's an opportunity to have an incredible look into a system which has enabled tax evasion, not only tax avoidance, but certainly definitely elements of criminality, and the way in which very wealthy people act to ensure that they don't share their wealth with the people in the countries where they're from.
It's been an issue that has been highlighted, and I think particularly from South Africa, or even the African continent, through the conversation of illicit financial flows. But seemingly, there doesn't seem to be clear answers in terms of who are these individuals that are involved with hiding these monies, and who helps effectively these wealthy individuals get away with this criminality. And oftentimes many will say, well, it's not exactly criminal, although it may be immoral.
Yeah, indeed, Kathy. I mean, the King of Jordan, Tony Blair, and a number of other heads of state have come out making exactly that argument today, to say, sure, we might have done this, we didn't break the law, we're kind of sliding around the edges of the law. But the ethical conduct is questionable. The impact of this, in terms of the impact on working people in those countries, are very clear when a head of state in for example, the Prime Minister or President rather of Kenya has an amount of about 500 million rand in property, his family sitting offshore. And if you look at the dire problems that ordinary Kenyans face, it's questionable as to how he's exercised his judgment and whether he ever declared those assets, which he's called in other members of parliament to do. But as you say, on the one hand, we have these lists that appear, and of course we salivate at who may be involved. But the real issue here is a system that's enabled them. And I guess, Kathy, the challenge and the difficulty is very often in the reporting is that we focus on the individuals, just like I have now, but really need to look at the system that's allowed this to happen. It's the role of accountants and auditors and lawyers and bankers. Many of them sit in Sandton in South Africa, but sit in centers across the globe, who are really responsible for constructing these shell companies, these offshore companies, whose only purpose is not to add any value to the global economy, but literally to suck out this cash out of countries like South Africa, like marrow from a bone, and ensure that it is deposited secretly in many, often in small island nations, but also in places like the United States and the United Kingdom, which are basically centers for criminality, as is Dubai, and where the proceeds can be hidden through laws that have enabled this to happen. And it really talks to the need for us to change the way that systems work, Kathy, crucially, if we're going to turn this around.
Hennie, you speak about the global nature of this network. How much more difficult then does it make accountability? Because oftentimes these are companies, as you've said, which are created for the sole purpose of maybe making sure that certain purchases go through, certain transactions go through, and then after that they very well disappear off the surface. And we've seen it, you know, in our own instances when we look at some of the dealings of the Guptas in this country, and where ultimately monies that were meant to go towards institutions, towards services in this country, ended up.
Yeah, and Kathy, I think, you know, one of the things that you know, we often reflect on out of leaks like these is that I think we're almost hypnotized as a public into this idea that there are certain rules that apply to very wealthy people and certain ways in which they behave, and we learn about them, but that's the kind of things that rich people do, right? And in fact, I think, you know, the problem with that is that it really further empowers them. There are tools, there are mechanisms that can be used to follow these people and to hold them to account. We are seeing the beginnings of that, for example, with the corrupt Gupta network and their global network of enablers, the corporations, the big banks like HSBC and others who work so closely with them, that there is some appetite within the National Prosecuting Authority, although it doesn't move quickly enough to hold some of these actors to account. But there are also laws that can be put in place to prevent much more of this happening. For example, the South African cabinet finally, after years, approved an amendment to the Companies Act, at least a bill that is now open for discussion last week Friday, which would make it a requirement for all companies to disclose and make public who are the ultimate beneficiaries, so who obtains value from any company. And so you then learn who the shareholders are of companies, who actually owns corporations. We need this to be a system that's put in place globally for a start. Countries like the United Kingdom have been dragging their heels. And again, I pointed out the United States has certain states, provinces, where it has become a normal practice for them to allow money laundering to take place, like the state of Delaware. We learned again from the Pandora Papers yesterday, the state of South Dakota, if I'm correct. And so I think the demand is on us in South Africa, but also other counterparts in other African countries, to be putting the pressure on those countries to say that you are enabling a system of plunder from places, not only, you know, from Europe and North America, but certainly from Africa, where Africa's wealth is being flitted out and into these centers, which is making those small countries, or in fact the United States, the United Kingdom, those very wealthy countries, even richer, and certainly making the lawyers and bankers and accountants very wealthy in the process.
Are there particular regions, Hennie, that are dominant players when it comes to offshore markets?
Yeah, Kathy, I think, you know, what we've seen since the 1980s was a real move when we saw the more rapid movement of cash around the world. And I think that what has really started in places like Europe. So when we think of the small countries like Luxembourg, Switzerland, and certainly the city of London, are built off a bedrock of criminality. There's no doubt that their countries are so wealthy, in part because they pioneered these schemes, together with many of the Britain's offshore territories. So in the Caribbean, places like the British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands are beloved by many South Africans, we're told, who like to move their cash there. And of course, close to home, there are places like Mauritius and other island nations like Singapore that have also have become quite adept at moving the money of very wealthy people offshore. So I think the practice has now spread to the point where there are dozens of these tax havens offshore. The crucial issue, Kathy, is that, you know, when we look at the issues of corruption, for example, in a country like South Africa, I often encounter people who would argue that we are the most corrupt nation in the world, and that's the sort of argument that's used. But I think, when you pick it apart, there's a global system of plunder that's taking place. And there are very wealthy nations who are benefiting from it. And I think it is important for us to recognize, and I think this is what the take-home we can take from the Pandora Papers beyond just the headlines of who the people are involved, that it's a system that must be effectively broken in order to achieve some element of social justice. And there's an incredible amount of work that needs to go into ensuring that we tackle the criminality that's become so normalized in this process of offshoring, of moving cash offshore and hiding the true owners of the capital who have done so.
Hennie, whenever we have this much money involved, it automatically means that the interests in the particular area will also be there'll also be quite a high number of interests. Does that make it difficult then to implement the proposition that you're making tonight, that this is a system that fundamentally has to be broken? But when you have people with money in politics and economics across the board, how much more difficult does that make it?
Absolutely, and I think, Kathy, it's recognizing that the monetary forces behind this are huge. The interests that they have invested in this are massive. Again, if we use an example like HSBC, which through Hong Kong was central to the state capture networks and the plunder of money in the last years in South Africa, that we believe took place, from what we understand, with the knowledge of the bank in Hong Kong. It's one of the world's largest banks. It was a bank that has also facilitated the movement of money of groups, as we've seen again at information that was presented at the Zondo Commission on money flows involving terrorist networks, drug cartels, and criminals who've wrought an enormous amount of damage, of social damage and pain on the lives of millions of working and working class people around the world. And so they do this, I think, with full knowledge. I think that's crucial to know. Those bankers who make those decisions know the harm that they're inflicting in another part of the world. And I think that's that, if you like, that element of callousness which suggests that they have little qualm to continue doing that. The importance is our ability to organize, the ability to push our politicians and the people we've elected across political parties and positions to change the way that system operates. What's clear from the Pandora Papers, of course, is it's the politicians in many countries themselves who have become embedded in that system. And I think, again, it places the pressure on us as ordinary people to find the kind of leaders who are not enmeshed in the system of not only of state capture and corruption, but of the search for enormous amount of wealth, and again, anything to avoid paying taxes. So I think the importance of organizing, of civil society groups calling for reform and placing pressure on our own government to be our voice at all the international forums, again, to do exactly that when they are meeting with their counterparts in other countries, demanding of them to do better at changing the system.
Hennie, unless I've missed it, I certainly haven't seen any South African names being mentioned in this report. Is that surprising?
Well, we haven't seen many names, Kathy. There was a report I know from Carte Blanche last night who involved, I'm told, in investigations where there were indications that there might be tens of thousands of South African links. So certainly, I think there may be names that are emerging in the next couple of days. I mean, some of the big hitters that have appeared in our region, of course, include Billy Rautenbach, the notorious businessman who is based in Zimbabwe, was facing charges for many years by the South African National Prosecuting Authority for involvement in a range of crimes, and at various points in the last 20 years was actively involved in the war in the DRC, so working very closely with the Zimbabwean military and the current head of state, Emmerson Mnangagwa, and supported Robert Mugabe in his 2008 elections, where he brutally suppressed many of the opposition groups. So a man who has been involved in various human rights abuses and in funneling the movement of money that enabled that. And again, the papers show how he moved, from what I understand, to be millions or tens of millions of dollars offshore. And again, it just shows you the kind of profits that are made through a range of questionable business enterprises that people like Rautenbach are involved in, but certainly how they tie into a global stream of the movement of capital. And there are other people like Denis Sassou Nguesso, the head of state of Congo Brazzaville, who has often been feted and sat on platforms with our president Cyril Ramaphosa, and his name has also been mentioned. So I have no doubt that there may very well be other South Africans that are going to be implicated in the days ahead as more of the reporting reveals this.
Well, certainly fantastic work done by the ICJI there, and of course, you know, the kind of effort it takes to do this kind of work has been incredible. Over 2 years that these investigations have been conducted in about 150 different countries, and involving journalists as well who've been working through these papers for over 2 years. That is, Hennie van Vuuren is from Open Secrets. Let's leave it there for tonight.